Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army.
It is great to be here for this.
Yeah, I mean, imagine trying to cure a 14 million to 1 crisis using literally nothing but a horse-drawn wagon and a $50 rented room.
It sounds impossible.
Right. But today we are opening a source document titled A Century of Concern, which it details the first 100 years of the Central Union Mission in Washington, D.C. from 1884 to 1984.
And if you think you know what charity looks like, I mean, this historical record is absolutely going to challenge your fundamental assumptions.
Oh, completely.
It forces a complete recalibration of how we view social intervention. What we have in these pages, it isn't just a ledger of donations.
No, not at all.
It is a massive, incredibly detailed architectural, geographical, and honestly psychological map of human survival. It chronicles a single organization adapting to the most volatile century in American history, surviving world wars, the Great Depression, the complete transformation of the urban landscape, and, the shifting demographics of poverty.
And for you listening, whether you are managing a nonprofit, studying urban sociology, or honestly just navigating the burnout that comes from trying to help people in your own life, this deep dive is a masterclass.
It really is.
We are looking at the sheer mechanics of how to run an organization through unprecedented crises while keeping a very specific, uncompromising core philosophy completely intact.
Exactly.
So, okay, let's unpack this. To understand the magnitude of this, we have to physically set the stage. We need to strip away our modern preconceptions of Washington, D.C.
Right, definitely.
Because when we say Pennsylvania Avenue in 1884, we are not talking about a polished, paved boulevard filled with motorcades and manicured lawns.
Far from it. I mean, you have to visualize a post-Civil War, rapidly industrializing city that is essentially just bursting at the seams. In 1884, Pennsylvania Avenue was a chaotic, muddy, sensory overload of a thoroughfare. You had horses, streetcars, raw sewage issues, and this incredibly dense convergence of transient populations.
Just a mess.
Totally. Keep in mind, the modern concepts of a federal social safety net, welfare, or clinical addiction treatment, they simply did not exist.
Right. There was no backup plan.
None. If you fell through the cracks of your family or your local parish, you hit the literal cobblestones. You had thousands of men swarming this avenue, completely unchurched, entirely disconnected from any familial support, and struggling with severe, untreated alcoholism.
And that is the incredibly bleak landscape Reverend Latham A. Douglas walks into.
Yeah.
He comes down from New York City, and his background is crucial here because he had been deeply inspired by the Jerry McAuley Water Street mission.
Right, which was a huge influence.
Huge. So he arrives in D.C., looks at the swarming mass of desperate humanity on Pennsylvania Avenue, and he doesn't lobby Congress for a vagrancy law. He doesn't look away in disgust.
No, he doesn't.
He sees a profound, immediate physical and spiritual crisis that just demands action.
Yeah, he takes it head on.
He gets a small group of friends together, they pray, and in 1884, they scrape together $50 a month to rent a single room at 909 Pennsylvania Avenue.
A single room designed to seat maybe 75 people. And it's sitting right in the middle of a massive urban crisis.
75 people, that's nothing.
It is tiny. What's fascinating here is the methodology Reverend Douglas employed from day one. It's what set the trajectory for the next century.
Right.
They held their first public service in January 1885. And within days, they encountered a man named Peter B. Sweeney.
Oh, this story's amazing.
It really is. Sweeney's own written testimony that night provides this microscopic look into the psychology of Douglas's approach. Sweeney described coming into that small rented room wet and draggled.
Just completely miserable.
Exactly. He was shivering at the absolute end of his physical rope, expecting to either be kicked out or preached at from a safe, sterile distance.
But Douglas completely shatters that expectation. He doesn't stand behind a wooden pulpit and lecture Sweeney about his life choices.
No.
He physically closes the gap. Douglas walks directly up to Sweeney, who is soaking wet, likely unwashed, and carrying all the odors and grime of the 1884 streets, and he just puts his arms around his neck.
He hugs him.
He embraces him, a total stranger, and he says, "My brother, I want you to love Jesus. He loves you and has died for you."
I mean, think about the psychological impact of that single gesture. In a Victorian-era society that actively and sometimes violently shunned destitute addicts, stepping across that physical boundary was a radical act of defiance against the social norm.
It really was.
It communicated instant dignity. Sweeney later wrote that he simply wasn't used to having anyone speak to him with such warmth, let alone pair it with genuine physical affection.
Wow.
The shock of that embrace bypassed all his defensive mechanisms. It forced him to actually listen.
It fundamentally rewired his perception of his own worth. And Sweeney doesn't just get sober, he eventually becomes the superintendent of the mission himself for 2 terms.
Which is incredible.
It is. And the source material is just full of these explosive, almost unbelievable transformations.
Yeah.
There is one specific narrative about a man named Pearl Clayton that perfectly illustrates the suffocating social stigma of this era.
Oh, the panhandling story.
Yes. So Pearl had been estranged from his family, living on the streets of D.C. as a vagrant for 18 years, surviving purely by panhandling.
18 years on the street.
Right. So one afternoon, he walks up to a well-dressed older man on the street and asks for coins. And he has absolutely no idea that the man he is begging from is his own father.
The layers of tragedy in that encounter are profound, especially when you factor in that his father was an established Methodist minister.
Oh, wow.
The father recognizes his son's face immediately, even through the dirt and the years of aging. But the source text reveals this heartbreaking detail.
What does he do?
Well, the father is walking with a companion, and in that split second of recognition, the father actually hides the truth.
You're kidding.
No, he makes up a lie on the spot, telling his companion that the young beggar is just the son of an old friend.
That detail is devastating. It really shows how deeply entrenched the shame of addiction and vagrancy was back then.
Exactly.
The father, a minister, is just momentarily paralyzed by the social embarrassment of claiming his own flesh and blood in that condition.
The stigma was like an iron wall. But the father's subsequent actions are what break that wall down.
Okay.
He doesn't just hand him a coin and walk away. He knows about the Central Union mission, and he manages to bring Pearl there.
That's a huge step.
It is. And once inside, Pearl isn't subjected to a theological lecture. He sits and listens to the testimonies of the converts. He is hearing men who had slept in the exact same gutters he did, now speaking with clarity and hope.
And his father is right there with him.
Yes, and at that moment, his father leans over and whispers that Pearl's mother had been praying for him every single day of those 18 lost years.
Wow.
The combination of seeing men who had survived his exact trauma, coupled with the realization that he was still loved, it just shatters his hardened exterior.
I can imagine.
He goes forward, accepts the mission's help, achieves total sobriety, and eventually builds a highly respected career as a government employee.
It is the ultimate full-circle redemption. But, as these stories multiply, Douglas and his team hit a massive logistical bottleneck.
Oh, for sure.
Because a single rented room, even packed to the gills, is passive. You are still relying on the destitute to have enough energy and agency to walk through your front door.
Right, they have to come to you.
Exactly. If you want to reach the thousands of men who are too broken, too drunk, or just too ashamed to enter a building, you have to change the delivery mechanism. So in 1887, they commissioned a custom-built gospel wagon.
And the physical specifications of this wagon tell a story of sheer ambition. Built by Pierce and Lawton in Georgetown, it cost around $770.
Which was a lot back then.
A massive sum for a charity in 1887. Yet they managed to pay it off entirely in one season through dedicated fundraising.
That's impressive.
It was a behemoth. 23 feet long, 8 feet wide, pulled by 4 hired horses. It featured folding seats that could hold 30 mission workers. And get this, they even bolted a small SD organ into the chassis.
An organ on a wagon.
Yes. And they would drive this massive musical convoy directly into market space and the most notorious impoverished sectors of the city.
I am fascinated by the mechanics of how this actually worked. They are pulling up to a crowded public square and drawing crowds of up to 2,500 people, pre-microphone, pre-amplification.
Yeah, it's raw volume.
But here is where I struggle with the concept. If you park a massive wagon in a gritty urban square and start street preaching, isn't that inherently confrontational?
You would think so.
I mean, I'm picturing someone shouting about hellfire and brimstone. How do you hold a captive audience of 2,000 rough, hardened men without a riot breaking out, or at the very least, people throwing rocks?
Well, the genius of the gospel wagon was that they completely discarded the condemnatory style of street preaching.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They understood that you cannot shame a man who is already living in the gutter. I mean, society has already done that for you.
That makes a lot of sense.
Instead, the medium became the message. The core of these wagon meetings relied almost entirely on testimonies.
Like Sweeney.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They placed men on the back of that wagon who used to be the most notorious drunks in those exact neighborhoods. Take Thomas B. Ironside, for example.
Okay.
He was a highly educated Scottish immigrant who had lost absolutely everything to the bottle. He had been reduced to sneaking into D.C. under the cover of darkness, sleeping in cemeteries just to avoid the police.
Wow, sleeping in cemeteries.
Right. And when a man like Ironside stood up on that wagon, sober, articulate, wearing clean clothes, and radiating purpose, he didn't have to shout. The visual evidence of the mission's philosophy was standing right in front of the crowd.
It flips the entire power dynamic. The crowd isn't being talked down to by some detached, wealthy philanthropist. They are looking in a mirror at their own potential future.
That shared trauma creates an instant, unbreakable credibility.
Yeah.
It was a masterclass in radical empathy.
Yeah.
They would hand out printed slips with hymn lyrics so the crowd could actively participate rather than just being spectators.
Yeah, it's smart.
The historical record specifically notes that when prayers were offered from the wagon, crowds of rough, hard-looking men would collectively take off their hats and bow their heads in absolute silence.
2,000 men doing that.
Yes, and you cannot manufacture that level of reverence through fear or volume. You earn it by presenting irrefutable, living proof that they are not beyond rescue.
But the success of the gospel wagon creates a new compounding problem.
Because of the scale.
Right. A wagon is an incredible outreach tool, but it's not a hospital. It's not a kitchen. You can't put a shivering man to bed on a wooden bench, and you can't feed 2,000 people from the back of a cart.
No, you definitely can't.
The sheer volume of people they were reaching necessitated permanent infrastructure. And this transition from mobile outreach to brick-and-mortar institution ushers in arguably the most defining leadership era of the mission's first half-century.
Which is John and Ada Jean Bennett.
Exactly, who take over as superintendents in 1915.
John Bennett's personal history is the vital anchor for this era. He wasn't a pristine academic theologian recruited from a seminary.
Right.
He was a former clothing salesman in Brooklyn whose life had been completely incinerated by alcohol. He actually authored a poem about his agonizing cycle of addiction that the mission later published.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and in it, he details trying all the accepted societal solutions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Like what?
Well, he tried sanitariums, which were basically lock-up facilities where you sweat out the alcohol with zero psychological support.
Sounds awful.
It was. He also tried signing temperance pledges, which was a massive cultural movement where men would sign a legally binding-looking document promising never to drink again.
But that doesn't actually cure anything.
Exactly. A piece of paper cannot cure a chemical dependency, and willpower alone always failed him. He always ended up back on the whiskey.
Until he found the Jerry McCauley Water Street mission.
Yes.
The exact same New York mission that originally inspired Reverend Douglass to start the D.C. operation.
The continuity there is striking. John Bennett finds his salvation in the very philosophy he is later called to direct.
That's incredible.
But when John and his wife Ada arrive in Washington, D.C. in 1915, they're not handed a well-oiled machine. They're handed a catastrophe.
Why? What was going on?
Well, the mission had moved to a building at 622 Louisiana Avenue, and it was dilapidated, crumbling fire trap. Worse, they inherited a massive $23,000 mortgage.
$23,000 in 1915.
Yes. Adjusted for inflation, that is a crippling, suffocating amount of debt for a charitable organization relying purely on the goodwill of donors.
They are essentially operating a bankrupt charity in a collapsing building.
Exactly.
And right in the middle of trying to figure out how to patch the roof and pay the interest on the mortgage, a phone call comes in 1916 that changes the entire trajectory of the mission.
The social worker call.
Yes. Ada Jean Bennett answers the phone. It's a local social worker desperately trying to find placement for 2 little girls.
Right.
Ada initially gives the logical answer. She says, "We are a men's rescue mission. We have a room full of recovering addicts. We have 0 budget. We have no staff trained for childcare, and we have no beds."
Which is completely reasonable.
Completely reasonable. But the social worker responds with a line that borders on emotional blackmail. She says, "I thought your institution was like a stagecoach, always room for one more."
It is a devastatingly effective psychological hook.
It really is.
And to fully understand Ada's reaction, you have to know that she and John had recently suffered the ultimate tragedy of burying their own young daughter.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So that phone call bypassed all her logistical defenses and hit her squarely in the heart. Despite having no resources, Ada tells the social worker to bring them over. She takes the two little girls directly into her own personal cramped living quarters.
And in that single, impulsive act of compassion, the children's emergency home is born.
It's amazing.
Now, I have to stop and challenge this from an organizational standpoint, because if you are listening to this and you've ever run a startup or a community project, alarm bells should be ringing right now.
Oh, absolutely.
You are drowning in debt, your building is unsafe, and your core mandate is rehabilitating destitute men. Isn't taking in vulnerable children the ultimate disastrous example of mission creep?
It definitely looks like it.
Doesn't that completely dilute their focus, risk catastrophic legal liability, and stretch their non-existent budget to the breaking point?
Well, if you view it through a strictly corporate lens, it looks like administrative suicide. But if we analyze this through the lens of holistic social work, it represents an incredible leap forward in their methodology.
How so?
You cannot isolate the destitute, addicted man from the collateral damage he leaves behind. The systemic fallout of the men's addictions was families shattered and children left without food, shelter, or physical safety.
Okay, that makes sense.
By opening their doors to the children, the Bennetts were treating the secondary trauma of the very disease they were founded to fight. They were attacking the root of generational poverty rather than just treating the adult symptoms.
But they still had to pay for it. They still had to navigate the legalities.
And that is where the Bennetts proved to be brilliant strategists. They knew their personal strength was on the front lines of human care, so they weaponized their board of directors to handle the bureaucracy. They recruited men like Edward H. DeGroot Jr., a highly capable executive with the Interstate Commerce Commission. The Bennetts essentially said to the board, "We are going to do the grueling day-to-day work of saving these lives. Your job is to figure out the corporate, financial, and legal scaffolding to keep the doors open."
It's a profound lesson in delegating to avoid burnout. They let the executives be executives so they could be caretakers.
Yes.
And Ada's dedication to that caretaking was relentless. The mission still had zero budget for this new children's wing, so Ada is doing the physical labor herself.
Right.
There is an anecdote from the archives that perfectly encapsulates her grit. One afternoon, two extremely wealthy D.C. socialites, Mrs. Seton Perry and Mrs. John J. Duff, drop by the mission unannounced.
Oh, this story.
Yeah. They are likely expecting a polite tour, perhaps hoping to find the superintendent's wife pouring tea in a parlor. Instead, they find Ada Bennett wearing a worn gingham apron, sweating, scrubbing floors, and doing the grueling, unglamorous physical labor of caring for these abandoned kids.
The visual collision of those two worlds must have been jarring. The pristine wealth of the socialites encountering the raw, sweaty reality of urban rescue.
Totally jarring.
But Ada's total lack of pretense proved her absolute dedication. She wasn't just directing charity, she was submerged in it. The impact of that visual was immediate. The very next day, the mail arrives, and there is a check for $50 from Mrs. Perry. Attached is a brief 3-word note.
Hire a servant.
Yes.
The bluntness of that is incredible.
And those monthly checks didn't stop. That single encounter forged a relationship of immense trust that would eventually alter the geographical footprint of the mission.
How to do that?
Well, years later, when the mission was desperate for a new facility, Mrs. Duff donated $100,000.
$100,000?
Yes, a sum that is almost unfathomable for the time. And she gave it specifically to build the children's wing of a new complex in memory of her sister.
I mean, think about that connection. If you are a modern nonprofit CEO and you open a completely unlicensed, unbudgeted new division in your own living room based on a gut feeling, your board would likely fire you for the liability risk.
Oh, in a heartbeat.
It highlights how the early days of urban charity relied heavily on instinct, immediate grace, and bold, terrifying leaps of faith over clinical bureaucratic planning.
And those leaps of faith were validated just in time because the ultimate catalyst for change arrived in the form of a literal trial by fire.
The 1922 fire.
Yes. In April 1922, the dilapidated Louisiana Avenue building finally gave way. Right as the nightly gospel service was commencing on the main floor, the top floor caught fire.
Oh, man.
The fire department responded quickly and extinguished the blaze, but the sheer tonnage of water required to put it out completely ruined the structural integrity of the lower floors. Plaster was falling in massive chunks, the walls were compromised, they were forced to evacuate immediately. The very people trying to house the homeless were now homeless themselves.
Which forces the board's hand. Edward DeGroot and the board execute a massive, high-stakes capital campaign. They raise over $200,000 and construct a state-of-the-art 7-story U-shaped complex at 613 C Street NW.
A huge upgrade.
It was a masterpiece of specialized design. The men's mission operated on one side of the U, and the children's emergency home operated on the other, ensuring safety and separation while sharing a central courtyard.
Really is.
They completed the construction and moved in by 1924. And the timing of that construction is one of the most fortuitous moments in the mission's history. They built a massive safety net just 5 years before the entire American economy collapsed.
The 1929 stock market crash and the subsequent Great Depression tested the structural and psychological limits of every institution in the country.
It really did.
The statistical explosion of human misery recorded by the mission during this era is staggering. To understand the scale, look at 1929, a year considered the peak of economic prosperity. That year, the mission served 13,557 free meals.
Okay, 13,000 meals.
But by 1935, as the Depression deepened, that number jumped to nearly 100,000.
Wow.
By 1939, they were serving 164,700 free meals in a single year.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Let's pause and look at the logistics of those numbers. If you run a restaurant, scaling your food production by over 1,000% in a decade is incredibly difficult, even with paying customers.
Almost impossible.
How does an organization that relies entirely on donations scale from 13,000 meals to 164,000 meals when the entire donor base is also losing their money? The math of the Depression seems impossible.
It requires a level of resourcefulness that borders on genius.
Yeah.
Before the federal government could even mobilize the New Deal, localized organizations like Central Union Mission were already acting as the primary social safety net.
Right.
They survived the math because they didn't rely purely on cash donations to buy food. They created an internal, closed-loop economy.
What does that mean?
They understood that the men coming to them needed food, but they also needed their dignity restored through labor. So they opened a wood yard and a broom factory in the basement of the mission, giving men a way to work for their keep.
Oh, that's smart.
But the most audacious move they made during this era was purchasing a farm.
Yes, Camp Bennett, a 234-acre farm out in Brookville, Maryland.
Right.
And the story of how they acquired it in 1934, right in the teeth of the worst economic disaster in the century, is fascinating. They didn't take out a loan.
No, they didn't.
The Women's Guild of the Mission organized a massive cultural event. They hosted Seth Parker concerts at Constitution Hall. For context, Seth Parker was a phenomenally popular radio character played by Phillips Lord, and they paired him with Homer Roadheaver, a famous evangelist and musician.
That's a big deal.
A huge deal. They sold out all 3,800 seats of Constitution Hall multiple times over, charging admission, and managed to raise $12,500. They bought the massive farm in cash, entirely debt-free.
The acquisition of Camp Bennett solved two massive logistical problems simultaneously. First, it provided an expansive rural escape for the children in the emergency home, getting them out of the sweltering, oppressive heat of the D.C. summers.
Which was so necessary.
And second, and most crucially for the food supply chain, it provided an agricultural laboratory for the unemployed men. The men at the city mission would travel to the farm, work the fields, and grow corn, potatoes, and vegetables.
And then what?
That produce was then trucked directly back to C Street to feed the 164,000 men coming through the doors. It was a brilliantly self-sustaining ecosystem of physical labor and nutritional survival.
But the spiritual labor behind the scenes was incredibly grueling. The mission later published a pamphlet that perfectly summarized their psychological approach during the Depression. They called it mining for diamonds in the rough.
I love this analogy.
The analogy they used is profound. They noted that in an African diamond mine, workers have to blast, dig, and move 3 tons of hard blue dirt just to yield a single 1-carat diamond.
3 tons.
Mathematically, that is a ratio of 14 million parts of dirt to 1 part of diamond. The mission viewed their endless, exhausting labor, the hundreds of thousands of meals, the thousands of loads of laundry, the delousing, the counseling sessions the exact same way. All of that physical effort was the dirt they had to move, without complaint, to unearth a single transformed human soul.
Because when the methodology worked, when they finally uncovered a diamond, the transformation altered the fabric of the community. Take the testimony of Joe Fisher.
Who was he?
Here was a young Baltimore police officer, a man sworn to uphold the law, who succumbed so completely to alcoholism that he was stripped of his badge, lost his home, and alienated his entire family.
Oh, that's tragic.
For 10 years, he lived as an absolute outcast, riding freight trains across the country, sleeping in boxcars. He finally washes up in D.C., a ghost of his former self. He walks into the mission, hears the testimonies, and something clicks.
He decides to stay.
He accepts the help, goes through the painful process of withdrawal and rehabilitation, and emerges sober. And to demonstrate his profound gratitude, Joe Fisher takes his restored physical agency and hand builds a beautiful, intricate, movable wooden pulpit. He donates it to the mission so the speakers could physically roll it closer to the men in the pews.
There is so much symbolism in that act. A man who had lost his authority as a police officer regains his dignity and literally builds the platform from which the next generation of broken men will hear the message that saved his life.
It perfectly encapsulates the mission's core belief. You don't just maintain a building, you build people, and the people build the mission.
Wow.
But as the immense pressure of the Depression finally gave way to the outbreak of World War II, the demographics of the avenue shifted drastically.
Right.
The lines of exhausted, unemployed older men were suddenly replaced by lines of very young, very overwhelmed servicemen on weekend leave, desperately needing a safe, uncorrupted place to sleep in the capital.
And the mission pivoted again. Ada Jean Bennett, whose husband John had passed away in 1937, oversaw the conversion of the facility into the Bennett Memorial Service Club.
They kept it going.
She kept the doors open for the troops right up until her own death in 1943. The Bennetts literally poured every ounce of their life force into that building.
They really did.
Their passing marks the end of an incredibly tactile, hands-on era, setting the stage for a massive organizational pivot in 1944. Enter Reverend Herbert E. Eberhardt and his wife, Mabel.
The Eberhardts bring a distinctly different, highly modernized energy to the mission. Herbert wasn't a former Skid Row addict who learned theology in the gutters.
Right, he was totally different.
He was a highly educated, polished seminary graduate who had already proven his administrative prowess by successfully running a major rescue mission in Indianapolis.
Okay.
His mandate from the board was clear: reconvert the facility from a wartime service club back into a hardcore functional rescue mission as the GIs were going home and the deeply entrenched transient population was returning to the city center.
Makes sense.
And Eberhardt brought with him a visionary understanding of something the mission had never fully utilized before: the power of mass media.
Which, when you think about it, is a fascinating contradiction.
Right.
You have an organization dedicated entirely to serving the poorest, most technologically disconnected, disenfranchised people sleeping on Skid Row, and yet they become aggressive early adopters of mass media and electric broadcasting.
It seems counterintuitive until you analyze the mechanics of charity.
Mm-hmm.
Eberhardt understood a fundamental truth. To serve the invisible and the disconnected, you must capture the attention and the wallets of the connected.
Ah, I see.
If the middle-class public doesn't see the mission, they won't fund it. He had to bridge the gap between the sanitized suburbs and the gritty reality of C Street.
And he bridged that gap with literal flashing neon lights. Let's talk about the electric witness.
Oh, I love this part.
Decades earlier, back in 1910, the mission had erected this audacious 90-foot electric sign on their roof that blazed Jesus, the light of the world, topped with a massive glowing star. It was a landmark.
Yeah, you couldn't miss it.
But when they moved into the new C Street building in the 1920s, strict D.C. zoning laws prevented them from installing anything similar. The skyline had gone dark.
But the psychological imprint of that sign remained in the minds of the citizens. People missed the visual anchor.
Right.
And in 1952, a retired, completely unassuming schoolteacher named Virginia Lyman stepped forward. She anonymously donated the massive funds required to navigate the zoning laws and install a breathtaking new beacon.
What was it?
It was a massive white neon cross, interlaced with brilliant red neon letters reading, "Come unto me." And it wasn't just visual, it was paired with a massive electric carillon that broadcast the chimes of traditional hymns over the noise of the city traffic.
Put yourself on that sidewalk in the 1950s. You are walking down a busy, cynical, politically charged D.C. street. You are surrounded by government buildings and concrete, and suddenly you hear the deep, resonating chimes of a hymn echoing off the pavement. You look up, and there's this towering, glowing invitation piercing the night sky.
It's an incredibly powerful disruption of the urban environment. But Eberhardt didn't stop at the skyline. In 1946, he launched the Hour of Power radio broadcast. He took the music, the raw testimonies of the men, and his own sermons, and he piped them directly over the radio waves into the living rooms, cars, and kitchens of the entire D.C. metro area.
The strategic value of the hour of power cannot be overstated. It bypassed the physical barrier of the mission's intimidating location. A wealthy donor or a struggling family didn't have to walk down into Skid Row to hear the work being done. The work came to them.
Exactly. But utilizing mass media, this raises an important question.
Okay, what is it?
When you scale your outreach to radio waves and 90-foot neon billboards, how do you maintain the intimate, deeply personal, arm-around-the-neck approach that Reverend Douglas founded the mission on? There's a profound risk of becoming sterile, institutional, and detached from the very individuals you are trying to serve.
The Eberharts circumvented that risk brilliantly, though. They didn't use mass media as a replacement for the personal touch. They used it as a funnel.
A funnel.
Right. The radio show and the neon cross were just the wide end of the funnel, designed to drive people into highly structured, incredibly intimate physical spaces. And this is where Mabel Eberhart proves to be a powerhouse of logistical compassion.
She really was.
She looked at the children they were bringing to Camp Bennett in the summer and realized a glaring flaw in the system. Those children were returning to unchurched, chaotic, and sometimes dangerous environments in the city during the winter.
The summer retreat was just a temporary Band-Aid. So Mabel launches Capital Children for Christ, bringing the kids into the mission every Saturday morning.
What did they do there?
She utilized cutting-edge educational tools of the era, like flannel graphs. For those unfamiliar, before television was ubiquitous, a flannel graph was a board covered in flannel fabric, and the teacher would use detailed, felt cutout figures that stuck to the board to visually construct stories in real time.
Oh, I've seen those.
Yeah, it was incredibly engaging tactile storytelling that held the attention of kids who had very little entertainment in their lives. But Mabel didn't stop with the children. She analyzed the ecosystem of poverty and asked the ultimate systemic question: who is managing the chaos of these children's lives? The mothers.
Thus, the launch of the weekly mothers' meetings. And what I find so impressive is that these meetings were not just an excuse to trap women in a room and preach at them.
Right.
They addressed the physical reality of maternal poverty. They distributed free clothing, vital household items, and provided deep personal counseling. But the absolute masterstroke, the thing that shows true radical empathy for the working poor, was the creation of Tiny Tots Time.
The psychological relief of Tiny Tots Time is profound. Mabel understood that a mother living in crushing poverty, constantly managing the stress of survival, does not have the mental bandwidth to sit and absorb spiritual or psychological counseling if a toddler is pulling on her skirt.
No, of course not.
By providing dedicated, safe childcare in another room during the meeting, the mission gave these women something they almost never experienced: an hour of uninterrupted peace. An hour to breathe, to be treated as an individual rather than just a caretaker, and to process their own trauma.
It acknowledges the quiet dignity of the mothers. The mission's operational aperture had widened significantly. It wasn't just about pulling a drowning man out of the gutter anymore. It was about stabilizing the entire family unit to prevent the next generation from falling in.
Exactly.
But even with radio broadcasts, neon signs, and comprehensive family programs, the mission was about to face a sociological earthquake. The 1960s and 70s brought tectonic shifts to America's inner cities. Civil unrest, changing drug epidemics, and severe economic shifts altered the very demographics of homelessness.
A whole landscape changed.
The mission had to adapt or die.
Which brings a completely different profile of leader to the forefront: Reverend Thomas B. Hanlon, who takes the helm in 1974. If Herbert Eberhart was the polished, media-savvy administrator, Thomas Hanlon was the absolute personification of the wounded healer.
The wounded healer. It's such an evocative term, and Hanlon embodied it entirely, because Hanlon, by his own admission, was a former Skid Row alcoholic.
And not just a mild case.
Right. He tells this terrifying, visceral story about his rock bottom. He was wandering the streets of Chicago in the dead of December. His vision was 20/600, meaning he was legally blind without his glasses.
Right.
But he had sold his glasses along with his winter coat and every other possession just to buy alcohol. He wanders into the Chicago United Mission, freezing to death, wearing summer clothes in a Chicago winter, unable to see clearly, utterly defeated by his addiction.
He was a textbook definition of a hopeless case.
Mm-hmm.
But the Chicago Mission didn't view him that way. They took him in, they rehabilitated him, and he eventually found his calling in the ministry.
Which is amazing.
Because he had survived the absolute darkest, most terrifying depths of Skid Row, His capacity for empathy as a leader in D.C. was practically limitless. There's a profound philosophy embedded in his leadership style.
Yeah.
When younger, frustrated staff members would come to him, angry that a man had broken the rules or relapsed again, they would ask, should we really give him one more chance? Hanlon would look at them and simply ask, what if the Lord hadn't given me one more chance? Many times over.
It strips all the arrogance out of the work. I look at Hanlon like a guide hired to lead a group through a deadly minefield. If you are standing at the edge of a minefield, you don't want the guide who just read a theoretical manual at a university.
No, definitely not.
You want the guide who has already navigated that exact field, who stepped on a mine, survived the explosion, lost a piece of himself, and now knows the exact topography of the danger. His lived experience gave him unparalleled, ironclad credibility with the men walking through the doors. They couldn't lie to him, and he couldn't dismiss them.
That deep, experiential empathy allowed Hanlon to recognize and respond to the changing faces of poverty that previous administrations might have missed. He noticed an alarming increase in elderly men.
Elderly men.
Yeah, men who weren't necessarily addicts, but who had simply been priced out of decent housing and left to rot in isolated, dangerous boarding houses. In response, he created the Harvesters Club, transforming a section of the mission into a safe, affordable, community-driven residence for seniors, complete with hot meals and field trips in the mission van to break their isolation.
That's wonderful.
But his most critical observation was recognizing that the streets were no longer solely a domain of men.
The demographic shift was undeniable. The number of homeless, vulnerable women sleeping on the grates of the Capitol was rising exponentially. In 1978, in direct response to this crisis, Hanlon and the board executed a massive logistical pivot.
The women's shelter.
Yes, they established the women's shelter on the second floor of the mission. They realized that a weekly mothers' meeting was no longer enough. Women needed a physically secure place to sleep every single night. They built a dedicated lounge, a kitchen, laundry facilities, and private rooms capable of housing 18 women, completely separated from the men's operations.
Hanlon's era is defined by this desperate, sprawling attempt to catch everyone who was falling through the cracks of a rapidly changing city. He even adopted the Dial-A-Teen hotline to provide crisis intervention for the terrifying spikes in teen suicide, pregnancy, and emerging drug cultures among the city's youth.
He was trying to catch everyone.
He was. But while Hanlon was furiously expanding the mission's internal programs to save lives, a massive existential threat was moving in from the outside, threatening to demolish everything they had built.
The PADC, the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation. The city government, backed by federal mandates, was executing a massive urban renewal project. They looked at the historic 600 block of C Street, where the mission had stood as a beacon for over 50 years, and they decided that a gritty rescue mission simply didn't fit the polished, tourist-friendly architectural vision for the new capital.
It is the classic, agonizing conflict between rapid urban gentrification and localized social services. The PADC wasn't measuring success in terms of meals served or addictions broken. They were measuring success in property values, tax revenue, and architectural aesthetics.
Yeah, completely different metrics.
The mission, through no fault of its own, had become an eyesore in the eyes of the developers. This initiated a grueling, highly stressful, years-long battle for the mission's very survival. They were subjected to a barrage of changing timelines, eviction rumors, and the terrifying prospect of having nowhere to go.
The psychological toll of operating a crisis center while your own institution is in a state of terminal crisis must have been crushing for the staff. Tragically, Reverend Hanlon's heart gave out. He passed away from a heart attack in 1981. He fought the bitter bureaucratic battle, he held the line, but he didn't live to see the resolution.
Which meant the monumental, incredibly complex task of actual relocation fell to his successor, Dr. Robert R. Rich, who assumes the leadership in early 1982. Dr. Rich inherited a mandate to not just keep the programs running, but to physically uproot an institution that had been anchored in one spot for half a century.
And the physical reality of that move was pure chaos. They managed to acquire a vacant auto showroom at 14th and R Streets in W.
An auto showroom.
Right. They are attempting the impossible, cramming the sprawling operations, the beds, the kitchens, the offices of two massive 7-story buildings into a single unrenovated 5-story building.
Oh, my goodness.
And they have to do it while actively running the daily rescue operations amidst the construction dust. Dr. Rich famously joked about the utter claustrophobia, saying you couldn't walk 3 feet in a straight line without stepping on, over, or around a pile of boxes or building materials.
But the relocation to 14th and R Streets proved a fundamental philosophical truth about the nature of their work. They were pushed out of the central downtown area and moved into a neighborhood that was, socioeconomically and criminally, much tougher and more volatile than the previous location.
Right. It was a rougher area.
Many critics question the wisdom and safety of moving the mission there. But if you look at the raw statistics comparing their final year at the old C Street building to their first full year at the new auto showroom, the results are staggering.
The numbers explode. The meals served jump from 64,000 to over 84,000. But the metric that the mission valued above all else, the number of men making a documented, conscious decision to change their lives, a decision for Christ, skyrocketed from 294 at the old location to 707 in their first year at the new location.
That's huge.
By moving into a worse, more impoverished neighborhood, they actually achieved a massive increase in their effectiveness.
Because the architecture isn't the mission. The address isn't the mission. The methodology and the people executing it are the mission. And Dr. Rich didn't just bring the old programs to a new building. He brought a highly systematic, modernized methodology.
Yeah.
He recognized that the chaotic nature of addiction in the 1980s required a more structured intervention. So he launched the Spiritual Recovery Program.
This program is a massive operational shift. They're moving away from the old model of come in, take a shower, get a bed, listen to a sermon, and hopefully you decide to change.
Yeah, the path of model.
Dr. Rich implements a rigorous 15-week basic curriculum of intensive study, mandated counseling, and structured work therapy. If a man completes that, he can opt into a secondary, equally rigorous 15-week discipleship seminar. Now, let's analyze the mechanics of this. So what does this all mean?
Let's look at it.
If a man stumbles in off the street, his brain chemically compromised by withdrawal, terrified, and struggling with basic physical survival, doesn't a strict 15-week academic and spiritual curriculum seem wildly overwhelming? Isn't that asking too much of someone who can barely function?
On the surface, it seems counterintuitive to demand rigor from the exhausted. But clinically and psychologically, structure is exactly the antidote to the disease of addiction.
How so?
Chronic homelessness and severe addiction completely erode a person's cognitive boundaries. Your entire existence shrinks to a chaotic, minute-by-minute pursuit of the next fix, the next meal, or the next safe place to hide. There's no schedule, no long-term planning, no executive function.
That makes total sense.
By enforcing a highly disciplined, phased program with strict daily schedules, Dr. Rich wasn't just downloading theology into their brains. He was actively rebuilding their neural pathways. He was restoring their executive function, their sense of time, and their capacity to achieve incremental goals.
You are giving them back the framework of a normal life. You wake up at this time, you work at this time, you study at this time.
Exactly. It fundamentally shifts the mission's goal. The early days were defined by pure rescue, throwing a life preserver to a drowning man, pulling him out of the water, and letting him rest on the deck.
Yeah.
The Spiritual Recovery Program is rehabilitation. You pull the man out of the water, but then you hand him a hammer and teach him how to build his own boat, ensuring he never grounds again when he leaves your ship.
Teaching him to build a boat, that perfectly captures the transition from dependence to agency. And when you look at the testimonies from this era, you see the profound generational impact of this structured approach. We have to talk about the story of Samuel J. Ross Jr.
Oh, this story is so powerful.
Because it bridges the historical eras of the mission beautifully. Samuel was a man whose life had been completely detonated by drinking. His addiction destroyed his marriage, alienated his family, and left him adrift. But before everything completely collapsed, he had managed to send his young 9-year-old son, Anthony, to the mission's summer program at Camp Bennett.
And that tiny seed of intervention at Camp Bennett is what eventually saves the father. Young Anthony goes to the camp, experiences a profound spiritual awakening of his own, and begins praying daily for his father's restoration.
Daily.
He prays for 2 straight years, holding on to this innocent, unwavering faith that his broken father can be fixed. Samuel, meanwhile, hits his absolute rock bottom, finally finds his way to the mission's adult programs, submits to the structured recovery, and rebuilds his life.
And then what happens?
When Samuel finally achieves sobriety and reunites with his family, he discovers that his agonizing journey to restoration was the exact, literal answer to the prayers his 9-year-old son had been whispering for 2 years.
It is an incredibly emotional proof of concept. The mission intervened with the sun at Camp Bennett, which provided the spiritual anchor, while simultaneously providing the structured adult rehabilitation the father needed to rebuild the family. It broke the cycle of generational trauma from both ends.
As the urban landscape of D.C. and cities all over the world continues to gentrify, pushing the impoverished further and further into the margins, the success of the 14th and R Street's relocation and the spiritual recovery program proves an enduring thesis.
What's that?
You can change the zoning, you can bulldoze the historic buildings, you can alter the physical tools of outreach, but if the systematic methodology of restoring human dignity and executive function remains intact, the mission will not just survive, it will thrive.
We have covered a massive expanse of history today, and we need to take a step back and synthesize the monumental arc of this century of concern. We started with the raw, desperate intimacy of Reverend Douglass wrapping his arms around a shivering, wet Peter Sweeney in a $50 rented room in 1884. We watched the Bennetts brilliantly leverage their board of directors to build a 234-acre farm without a dime of debt, while the entire national economy collapsed during the Great Depression. We saw Reverend Hanlon weaponize his own traumatic history on Skid Row to pioneer outreach for a new demographic of homeless women and teens. And we saw Dr. Rich systematize the chaos of addiction into a rigorous curriculum inside an abandoned auto showroom.
The physical execution evolved constantly. They progressed from standing on a horse-drawn gospel wagon to illuminating the skyline with a 90-foot neon cross, broadcasting over the radio waves, and utilizing tactile educational tools like flannel graphs.
But underneath all of that rapid innovation, the foundational philosophy never moved an inch in 100 years. Help for the helpless, hope for the hopeless.
And there's a profound, incredibly relevant takeaway here for everyone listening. It doesn't matter if you're trying to guide a Fortune 500 company through a market disruption, leading a community organization, or just trying to hold a fractured family together.
Right.
True, century-spanning endurance requires the mastery of two distinct, almost contradictory disciplines. You must possess uncompromising, unwavering core principles, but you must pair those principles with radical, fearless flexibility in your execution.
You have to be willing to open a children's home in your cramped living room or buy a massive farm when the banks are failing, if the reality of the mission demands it.
It is the ultimate synthesis of deep conviction and ruthless adaptability. You hold the why with an iron grip, but you hold the how with an open hand.
But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. We live in an era characterized by massive, complex systems. Today, billions of tax dollars are deployed annually into state-sponsored welfare programs, highly clinical rehabilitation facilities, and sprawling bureaucratic safety nets designed to eradicate poverty.
Yeah, it's a huge system.
Yet, in a century of concern, we just witnessed a single, localized organization achieve 100 years of documented, multi-generational, life-saving success, relying entirely on voluntary charity. And they achieve this based on a fundamental, uncompromising belief that the root of human brokenness isn't merely a lack of affordable housing or a deficit in a bank account or a chemical imbalance. They believed down to their marrow that the root of the crisis was deeply spiritual.
They recognized that the external devastation, the lost jobs, the ruined health, the life on the street, are ultimately symptoms of a profound internal collapse.
So here's the question you have to ask yourself as we navigate our modern, highly clinical world. Could it be that in our frantic rush to treat the visible symptoms of societal decay with bureaucratic efficiency and spreadsheets, we have entirely forgotten how to treat the soul?
If we only treat the physical symptom, we may prolong a life, but we never cure the underlying disease that robs that life of its purpose.
We are back to the jagged white line of a broken bone. You can fix the math, you can build the facility, and you can regulate the symptoms. But human trauma, addiction, and poverty are deeply murky waters. And to truly fix them, sometimes you have to put away the clipboard, abandon the safety of the protocol, step into the mud, and just put your arms around someone's neck. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the archives of human compassion. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep connecting the dots.